Drops can be challenging and a little bit scary, especially if you're coming into them without a lot of speed. Today I'm going to show you the #1 technique that's going to help you get over drops. Not only that, but in addition to learning today's skill, we've set up a bit of a challenge. Behind me here is a 3.5 foot tall box that's about a wheelbase long. I'm going to only have enough room to track stand before I go into the technique, and then it's the 3.5 foot drop to flat. So this is the ultimate test of this technique. If I can do it on this, we should have no problem applying this one technique to the trail. My name is Aaron. Welcome to Super Rider. On this channel, we break down complex bike skills into easy to learn techniques so you can quickly apply it to your riding. Before we drop into this technique, let's first talk about the bike setup. #1, our hand position on the handlebars. I recommend moving your hands out as wide as possible so just your index finger is grabbing the end of the brake lever. This gives you a ton of bike control, but also helps you quickly modulate your braking with the most power. #2, start practicing this skill with flat pedals if at all possible. Even though you're going to start on flat ground, you'll likely fade off to the right or the left until you build control. #3, gearing. When we're practicing the basics of this skill, I normally recommend a gear that you can push quickly but still has some power behind it. Usually the 4th gear does that for me, but you might play around with this a bit as you progress. Now that we've got our bike setup dialed, let's pick up exactly where we left off in the last video about wheelies. If you missed it, no big deal. We're going to cover off a lot of that stuff right now, but if you want to go a little bit deeper into the basics of this technique, I'll put a link in our description and you can check it out later. When we come up to a drop without enough speed, we need to find a way to quickly generate a lot of momentum to get us over the drop. But we also need to do that in a way that allows us to maintain the maximum amount of control of the bike so it doesn't get away from us. The best way to accomplish all of those things under control is to start with our opposite foot at the top of the pedal stroke as our front wheel gets to the edge of the drop. We use that first pedal stroke to lift the front wheel up, and as our back wheel gets to the edge, our strong foot comes around to the top of the pedal stroke. That puts us in the most comfortable, confident, and controlled riding position as we go off the drop. The one thing I wouldn't recommend is waiting until you get to a drop to attempt this technique for the very first time. That's why we worked on the Wheelbase Drill in our last video. That drill was all about putting a line on the ground, starting with your opposite foot on the top of the pedal stroke and pedaling to lift your front wheel in the air and keeping it in the air until your strong foot came across and your back wheel crossed that line. I said at the time that was a very foundational skill, and I think now you can understand why. Let's focus in on this wheelbase drill. This is going to build our confidence for the real deal. Using this pedaling technique is what creates the momentum to get us off the drop. One key thing to remember is that our hips do a lot of the work in this motion. Keep the front wheel unweighted by shifting your hips to the back of the bike as you initiate that pedal motion. Let me quickly demonstrate a few examples of the wheelbase drill. Remember that we want to be in full control as our back wheel crosses that line, and when you can do that consistently, you're ready to move on. If you want to push it even a little bit further, see if you can go past that line while continuing to maintain control. Once you're ready and feeling confident to move on, we can start looking at the drops themselves. The next thing we have to work on now that we've got the wheelbase drill locked in is our position on the bike as we go off the drop. So you'll recall that we used our hips to push to the back of the bike, which lifted our front wheel up as we brought our strong foot around to the top. Now what we need to do is move our center of gravity to match the landing of the drop. There are basically two different styles of drops. There's the drop to flat, or there's a drop to a downhill transition. In general, we want to match the angle of the bike to the angle of the landing, and that's what we'll work on next. We're going to break these two apart and work on each one individually. Let's start by talking about the drop to flat. In this scenario, we don't have a downhill transition to soak up the impact for us, so we have to use the bike to do the job instead. You're going to land your back wheel a split second before your front wheel touches down, and that's going to help soak up the impact of the drop. The best place to practice this skill is off the curbs in your neighborhood. It's a super low consequence environment, so if your front wheel drops a little bit early, it's not that big of a deal. I have a box that's about curb height here in the warehouse. Let's examine the technique. A lot of people think that wheelies need to have the front wheel way up in the air. See how I try to keep that front wheel low as I come off the box? That single element allows me to stay in control of the bike and prevents the back end from getting away from me. I push the handlebars away and bend my knees a little extra during the pedal strokes, and that helps keep the front wheel low. One tip I like to think of when I'm riding is that my body acts like an additional layer of suspension. So I like to keep my knees and elbows a little bit loose and bent That way when I land, my body can help soak up the landing. Actually, another thing I want to mention is what we do with our brakes. So typically once you've initiated that pedaling movement, you're done with your brakes until you land the drop. The worst thing you could possibly do while riding a drop is grab the back brake when your front wheel is in the air, because that's going to make your front wheel drop down, and typically you would flip over the bars. Not ideal. So it's better in my experience to have a little bit of extra speed going off the drop and readjusting your body in the air than trying to use your back brake to modulate your position on the bike as you're riding off something. The next style of drop is into a transition. Larger drops usually have a downhill transition to try to soak up the momentum and the energy from the drop. These take a little bit more confidence because as soon as you go off the drop, you have to match the transition with your wheels, which typically requires you to tip your front wheel down just a little bit. Now that we've got this concept down and we've really put in the time with our wheelbase drills, it's time to put it to the test. Here we have my 3.5 foot tall box, and I'm going to remove the transition landing, which means I not only have to get the pedal stroke perfect, but I have to readjust my body quickly in the air to prepare for that landing. Wish me luck. Perfect. Textbook technique on that drop. You probably won't find yourself in that tight of a situation anytime soon, but isn't it good to know that you can call on this technique anytime you run out of speed before a drop? My best advice is to put in the time with that wheelbase drill, building your confidence. Use the curbs and small ledges in your neighborhood. Truly, unless you're competing in Red Bull Rampage, you don't get bonus points for sending it off of big drops. Just start small, build your confidence, and then go from there. If this video was helpful for you, consider sharing it with someone that you ride with. If you want to continue progressing your bike skills, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you can see the next technique we're going to work on. And if you can't wait that long, go check out this playlist right here with all the stuff we've already done. In any case, have fun out there, and don't forget, practice makes progress.